For my money, the Death Klutch DK1 gopher trap is the best gopher trap on the market, even right out of the box. DK1 is mass produced and relatively inexpensive, and because it's mass produced, there are some production tolerances that you can fine tune and tweak and make the trap even better. In this video, I'm going to show you a few of the tricks that I've come up with, fine tuning if you wish. Nothing really drastic, but if you do a few of these things, you can take your gopher trapping to the next level and enhance your catch rate. Okay, I've zoomed in on this trigger rod area, and I want to give you an explanation on what we're going to try to accomplish here. In order for this gopher trap to snap shut, the trigger rod has to be able to lift up, and then the trap jaw has to slip out between the short part of the trigger rod and the long part. So you can see what's happening here now, right down in this area here, right toward the end of this main rod. The short part of the trigger rod is interfering, so it's right up against there, and actually we're bending that rod, trying to get it raised up enough so that that'll release. So what we're going to do is put that, we'll just put this end of this in the vise, and then I'll take a chainsaw file, and then I'm just going to just take a little bit off the end of that bent hook there, and that'll enable this trigger rod to raise up and it'll go shut. Now I put the trap in a vise, and I'm holding it. I'm holding the bent rod that holds the trigger rod, and I've marked that with a white paint stick. And it's just right here on the end is where that rod was interfering, preventing that trap from easily releasing. So I'm just going to take I've just got a regular 732 chainsaw file here, and I'm just going to take a little bit off that, and we'll see how it works. On this trap, what I've done is I've taken a chainsaw file and I made a little modification to that hook on the end of the main frame, and now I'll show you how much easier it is to slide that trigger rod into place. They usually always start out good way out here on the shoulder, but then as you move them forward toward the middle, that's the time when you were getting that interference. And now you can see that chainsaw file has made a provision in this bent hook, so the top of that trigger rod can fit in there. You can do a little check now to see if that trigger rod is going to release from the jaw easily. I'll just put my hand underneath here. When I squeeze it together, you can see that the trigger rod goes up, and then because I've made that alteration there, it releases easily. I'm going to slip on a couple pieces of plastic tubing over the jaws. The main reason is just to get my fingers out of the way when I'm taking the video. So with that little modification on the hook on the end of the main frame, you can make those jaws release from the trigger rod real easily. Okay, on the trap that hasn't got the modification yet to that hook on the end, I've slipped those couple pieces of plastic tubing over the jaws just to help illustrate the action of the trigger rod. Okay, after the trigger rod is released from the trigger, it has to move up, and at this point you can see that there's a lot of interference there, and the jaw doesn't want to release from the top portion of that trigger rod. In actual use, even though we're doing this kind of in slow motion and it's taking a lot of pressure to release that jaw from the trigger rod, the speed in which the trap closes in a lot of cases will overcome this deficiency, and the trap will, a trap right out of the box will still fire. But I have had a couple inquiries from my video saying that the trigger rod was released from the trigger and yet the jaws didn't close. And I'm just guessing, but I'm pretty confident that the problem is this interference down here is just too great. So even though that there's spring tension on that, there's enough interference there to prevent the rod from coming up and releasing. When this rod is released, it happens in a split second, so you can't really see what's going on. But in order for that trap to close, the trigger rod has to raise far enough so that it releases from the top, the short portion of the hook. I'm gonna take the plastic tube now and squeeze them together, and just give you an idea. This particular trap is real tight, and it would have a real difficult time getting set off. I'm putting a lot of pressure on that. And that trigger rod still isn't releasing. Some people now, to overcome this problem, rather than altering the hook end of the main frame, what they're doing is just, when they get that top part of the trigger rod hooked over the jaws, then they're just bending, they're just grabbing that long portion and bending it down and opening up that area that hooks over the jaw. And while that'll work, I don't recommend it, because what's happening is you're bending the long part, or the part that goes underneath the jaw. That's the part that you're bending, and if you bend it enough, pushing down on that a lot. I'm bending that. If I bend that enough so that opening gets to be loose enough to release that jaw easily, then what you have is what I call a lazy jaw. You've altered the geometry of that trigger rod, so this jaw then doesn't lay down flat against the frame. And it'll be partially closed. So and I recommend that you do the alteration on the hook part of the end, the bent part, rather than just try to bend it open. But now that I've bent that open, see, that does release. So that, I guess that is an option, but if you look at the end view, it's not laying down flat, and it'll end up kind of what I call a lazy jaw. When the trigger's set off on this trap and it springs shut, it happens in a split second, so you can't really see what's going on. But I want to demonstrate something for you. What happens to the trigger rod when the trap is set off? So I just released the trigger on this trap. I'm going to reach underneath here, try to keep my fingers out of the way, and close the trap. Okay, what you can see is that trigger rod coming up, and it comes up quite a ways before it's released. If you haven't done any modification on this trap, it comes up even more. I recommend setting that trap in the set hole at 10 o'clock, and one of the reasons is the trigger rod then, when the trap closes, will be firing more off to the side than straight up. It's still firing straight up as far as the trap is concerned, but if you have the trap in the set hole at 10 o'clock, then it'll be in reality kind of firing to the side. So this is a random trap out of a box of a dozen, and most of the other traps, there wasn't a huge interference issue between the top of the trigger rod and back here on the loop. This one here, it would have been very difficult to set this trap without some modification. First of all, this loop here on the trigger rod is real tight, and it would have been really difficult to push that down to get underneath the trigger. And with that amount of tension on that trigger rod, there would have been some adverse effects on the way this trap would be set off. So in order to overcome that, a common practice is to just bend this trigger rod down, open up this loop. But you can see in this position, there's very little clearance between the bottom frame and the jaw, and that's a good situation. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a common modification to the trigger rod. A lot of people do this just to get added clearance there, but I want to show you what the real effect is. So I'm going to take that up. I'm going to take the trigger rod and bend it down in an attempt to open up that loop. And but what's happening is only the bottom part of the trigger rod is significantly bent. The top part pretty much stays the way it is. So okay, so now you go to set your trap. Oh man, I like that because it slips right in there. But the problem is, after you wind the spring, okay, by bending that, just by bending the trigger rod, now you can see that it, and I haven't even hooked this yet. It misfired the first time, but now you can see, now you got a lazy jaw here. because that trigger rod has been modified or it has been bent in a place where it shouldn't been. So now you got this big space in between the main frame and the jaw, and I guess that's what I call a lazy jaw. And you can see, besides having the possibility of a misfire because you got that too loose, you've effectively reduced its wingspan there. But the biggest issue and the biggest problem with this, when you get this lazy jaw effect, is let's say that this bottom frame is still right down against the bottom of your set hole. Look at the position of this lazy jaw. It's sticking up. So when the gopher comes along, there's an obstacle there. He's going to sense, and he'll probably plug short. So I've just for the sake of illustration, I bent that rod. Normally I wouldn't do that. I would take care of the interference down in this area between the hook and the short portion of the rod. Just as important as a fine-tuned trap is a fine-tuned set hole. And we're big on the Burrow Buddy. With the Burrow Buddy, you can fine-tune the hole. You can fine-tune the set hole. You can customize it. Similar, just like you customize the trap, customize the hole that you set the trap in. It's very important. The right size set hole, probably the most important ingredient, the most important variable in your gopher trapping.